Joints, the ability to have flexibility and mobility in your skeleton. This is what allows the muscles to create angles and movements along your skeleton. So really, joints are known as articulations. Articulations is where two bones come together. It could be 3 bones, 4 bones, but it's where the bones are coming together that allows for movement to occur. Now, one thing to keep in mind, it's not only movement like think elbow or shoulder. There are some joints that have very little movement, but it's still where two bones come together. So really, the functionality here, mobility of the skeleton and helping to hold the skeleton together. Because by creating the mobility, the ability to move, you have gaps or spaces between the bones. The joints then are meant to help hold those bones together. So kind of cohesively holding the skeleton while allowing for some movement. We have to be able to classify joints though. There's going to be 2 different ways to classify. There is the functional classification we'll start with, and then there'll be the structural classification. The functional classification is how they move. So first off, we have this synarthrosis. Synarthrosis is going to be pretty much no movement. Think the sutures of the skull. It's where the two bones come together. They're really not meant to move. They might move a little bit, but in synarthrosis, they're really not meant to have much movement. So if a joint is synarthrosis or synarthrotic, it's not really going to be moving much at all. It's meant to be held in place, keeping the two bones or more bones held together. The second functional classification is amphiarthrosis. Now you can see here, showing 2 vertebrae. That space between, that joint is an amphiarthrosis or amphiarthrotic joint. It's allowing for slight movement. I mean, it's not moving like your wrist could move or your elbow, but there is movement between the actual vertebrae. So amphiarthrosis. And the last one is diarthrosis. Diarthrosis or diarthrotic movement, that's what we think of with the shoulder, the elbow, the full movement, a lot of range to the actual mobility. So 3 different types of functional classifications, looking at synarthrosis to amphiarthrosis to diarthrosis. Now, taking these functional classifications, we need to apply them to the structural classifications. So the structural classifications are based on what the joint is made of, hence the materials binding the bones. And each type of those different joints here will have different materials. We'll have a total of 3 different main categories for structural classification. Now within each one of these 3, there's subcategories, but there's 3 main types of these structural joints. And also, it's based on is there or is there not a joint cavity. So we'll start things off with the fibrous joints. The fibrous joints are the first of the structural classifications. These fibrous joints are made up of fibrous tissue, of course. So all of these joints, whether they're very close or have more space, are having a fibrous material holding the bones together. There will not be any joint cavities present. So in fibrous joints, they don't have joint cavities. Most of them are going to be immovable. That means the vast majority of these fibrous joints are simply just holding the bones together. They're not trying to give flexibility. Now again, remember, there might be a little shift here and there, but we're talking millimeters of movement, not free range that you're thinking of with actual joints. So most of these are immovable. Now within this fibrous joint category, there are going to be 3 subcategories. So 3 different types of fibrous joints. The first of the fibrous joints to cover are the sutures. Now, going back to the skeletal system, looking at the actual skull, all the sutures are what hold those bones together. It's what holds the 2 parietal bones together, or the frontal bone to the parietal bones. Those sutures are a type of fibrous joints. That's the connective tissue holding those joints together. Now, you might not think of the sutures of the skull as joints because they're not moving, but again, a joint is simply two or more bones being held together. Now, the functional classification here is synarthrosis because there's really not movement of the sutures. So the suture is going to be a type of fibrous joint, and the actual functional classification is synarthrosis. So structural is fibrous sutures. Functional is synarthrosis. But to stay in the sutures category, we have fontanelles. Now, fontanelles are going to be these little spaces here, you can see on the top, and a little on the back. Those are little spaces that are filled with fibers again in between the bones. Difference is there's a little more space for the actual fontanelle. Now, this is going to be a fetal skeleton. The idea is through the birth canal, so vaginal birth, the skull has to be able to kind of collapse a little bit. The fontanelles allow the actual bones to shift over each other just a little bit. That allows for a little bit of a collapse in the skull to be able to pass through the actual vaginal canal. So these fontanelles are allowing the skull to have a little shift, a little movement at birth. Now, after birth, these fontanelles will start to close up. The actual bones will grow closer together. The fontanelles will disappear. Next thing up is synostosis. Now, synostosis is going to basically be a fusion between the bones. In the fetal skull, the frontal bone and the maxillary are actually two separate bones to start with. But those bones, after birth and as the skull grows, they actually fuse together. There won't be a suture between them. So the frontal bone starts off as two, but then fuses together to make one. So it's not actually a suture between. So the term synostosis is going to be when the bones fuse, and instead of just having a suture holding them, they've fused completely. It's just bone, completely bone. No joint, nothing at all. So all under the sutures category, and the idea of how things are being built here. The second subcategory under fibrous joints is syndesmosis. Now, a syndesmosis is going to be a fibrous connective between two different bones. You can see here the radius and the ulna. This part in between, that fibrous material is the syndesmosis. It's what helps to hold the two actual bones of the forearm together. It is pretty much immovable to slightly movable. I mean, think about your radius and ulna. Do those bones really ever separate? No, they're always together. Now, sure, when you go through pronation and supination, the actual bones themselves are shifting a little bit. But that's the slight movement, because not separating, not moving, they're just kind of pulling back and forth under pronation and supination. So from not really too movable to a slight movable, that's the idea of syndesmosis. Hence why it's amphiarthrotic or amphiarthrosis. Slight mobility, to make sure it can move a little bit, but not huge mobility like you would think of for the shoulder or the elbow. The third subcategory under the fibrous is going to be gomphosis. Now, gomphosis, you can see here as a tooth. Gomphosis is going to be the cone shape. So it's this part going down around. That's the gomphosis. So it's being held in place, kind of keeping the actual structure in place. The actual true fibrous connection in this gomphosis are periodontal ligaments. Those would be little attachment points, little tiny ligaments going across and basically anchoring that tooth into the actual socket, so into the maxillary or mandibular bones. So the idea of a gomphosis, helping to anchor the tooth in place. Now, the teeth itself, each individual tooth, synarthrosis. Synarthrosis or synarthrotic is not really movable. I mean, do your teeth typically move? Not much. Sometimes you might wake up in the morning and notice you put your bite together and it doesn't quite line up. Maybe you're clenching overnight and realize a tooth moved a little bit. Maybe you bit into something really hard and it just shifted a little bit. The teeth can shift, Hence the whole principle behind braces, actually. Slowly moving the tooth, just a little movement at a time, inside of the gomphosis, in the actual connection point. But the teeth themselves aren't really meant to move, hence synarthrosis. So 3 different types of fibrous joints. Let's move into cartilaginous joints. Now this is the second of the 3 main functional categories. We've already covered fibrous, now it's time for cartilaginous. Cartilaginous joints, just like the name implies, are made of cartilage. Now these do not have joint cavities either. So cartilaginous, no joint cavities. Most of them are little to no movement. So again, similar to the fibrous, they're really not meant to have a lot of movement. Some of them don't even have any movement. And there will be a total of 2 different subcategories here. So we'll have 2 different types of cartilaginous joints. First one up is the synchondrosis. Synchondrosis is one of the subcategories of cartilaginous joints. When you start looking at the synchondrosis, it's this hyaline cartilage right here that's helping to hold this bone together. If you're saying, well, hold on, that's the epiphyseal plate. Very true. One of the examples is going to be the epiphyseal plate. It is a joint because it's holding the bone at the end of the bone plus the shaft together. So the diaphysis and the epiphysis are being held together because of this cartilage, the epiphyseal plate. So that's one example. Now, obviously, it's only in children because once you reach adult height, that becomes the epiphyseal line, pure bone. The cartilage goes away. So another example we have is going to be the costal cartilage between the first rib and sternum. So thinking way up top here, because just anchoring in. There's really not much movement there. That first rib is meant to more be anchored in place, to hold in place. I mean, even if you take a deep breath, it's the lower ribs that are moving. That first rib doesn't really move much at all. So synchondrosis is the structural name, while the functional is going to be synarthrosis. Synarthrosis, really not movable. Might move a little bit here or there, but it's meant to be more stable and kept in place. So functional synarthrosis, structural cartilage, which is a synchondrosis. So synchondrosis is cartilage. The second type of cartilaginous joint is the symphysis. Now in this case, you're seeing the symphysis is right here. That is actually called the pubic symphysis, but it's a symphysis. Now this is looking at more fibrocartilage. So the previous we're looking at was hyaline cartilage. This is fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage a little bit firmer, a little bit stiffer. But this is amphiarthrosis or amphiarthrotic. It's meant to have a little bit of movement to help shift things around a little bit. The example we saw here already is the pubic symphysis, but intervertebral joints. Think about when you bend, when you move. Those movements, those vertebrae, as they shift a little bit, that's this symphysis. It's how the actual vertebrae are being helped to hold together. So again, a little bit of movement, a little more than the other previous. So the symphysis, one of the types of cartilaginous joints. So structural, cartilaginous, symphysis, functional, amphiarthrosis, slightly movable. So 2 of the different categories there. So we covered fibrous joints, we've covered cartilaginous joints. From not really moving at all to a little bit of slight movement. We haven't gotten to the full diarthrotic, full movement like you'd have in your wrist, in your elbow, in your shoulder. So these have been more just slightly movable to really not movable at all. Next coming up has to be joints that are now movable, or the diarthrotic.